So this is sort of a combined review on this Artifex and recent experience I had dealing with Mark Richmond of Chef's Knives to Go, whose name Richmond is obviously borne by these knives. So I started my experience with them buying this Richmond Artifex in M390, and as you've seen from my review, performance was not as good as spyderco's M390, but it was sufficient to work. It's a high carbide volume steel, so as typical, you use sort of more obtuse apex angles, and the carbides bear the brunt of the work. It's not as good as spyderco's treatment of M390, but it worked. I was pleased with it, so I thought I would move to another Richmond knife. So I purchased this. This is their 240mm gyuto Artifex, the tall version, as I do recall. Again, and there were sort of the minor quibbles about fit and finish here and there, but the real problem was that the edge performance was crap, and I spent quite a bit of time messing around with it, trying to get it to perform well. As you can see, there's Sharpie here from some of my work, resharpening it, and playing around with it. And while I was trying to troubleshoot it, I thought, perhaps this isn't representative of AEB-L from this from the OEM Lamson & Goodnow. And so I bought a third, which was this Hanasuke, and this is the one you haven't seen, and so I started playing with that too. The short answer is that the AEB-L in this was no better than the AEB-L in this, and I had a video I just put up on this. You saw I sharpened it again. AEB-L razor blade steel, high edge stability, fine grain, takes a fine apex angle very well, and so just as a final sort of DX, sharpened it to 10 degrees inclusive, and I mean literally cutting the vacuum wrap that a cured meat came in. So this was, in this particular case, linguica, but think sort of like what hot dogs came in. This damaged the knife to over half a millimeter deep into the apex, and if you do some basic trigonometry at 10 degrees inclusive, that means that it took damage, material loss to half a millimeter deep, rippling beyond this. It took damage into the apex, which was deeper, where the steel was thicker than the plastic it was cutting. So this is just sort of something to note here. So I didn't actually complain to Mark Richmond initially. I just figured, okay, well, shucks, not every knife is good, move on. But after a conversation with Cliff, I did decide to contact Mark Richmond, not to say I demand a better knife or anything like that, but to say I wanted to know if, because these knives were quite heavily promoted and quite well reviewed by him, if another particular knife on his website could be expected to perform as advertised, unlike these, or not. And his response was to post my email on his public forum about his knives. And he posted it in the sharpening Q&A section, and then implicitly stating that I don't know how to sharpen his knives, and then backtracking, explicitly saying, you probably made a sharpening error. So I explained I hadn't, and then he basically left me to his dogs, who completely shredded me. I was getting all kinds of inane arguments saying that, sharpening to 10 degrees inclusive isn't reasonable, these knives can't perform past 30 degrees inclusive, things like that. And it was sort of broadly, overarchingly ignoring the actual argument, which is that this knife is outperformed by a low-end wusthof knife at identical sharpening angles. In this particular case, it was something like 30 degrees inclusive, roughly, which he still claims was within the purview of sharpening. But this was not particularly relevant. I was left on this forum to be ripped apart, which I was, and, there were all sorts of insane arguments going around, things like, you can't, despite this being advertised as a razor blade steel, and it is, arguments like, well, you wouldn't expect your razor blade to do this and that, and well, actually, technically, yes, you would. You would not expect your razor blade to fail cutting plastic because plastic is easier to cut than the keratin, which is what your hairs are made out of, things like this. So, it was completely ridiculous, and finally, by the end of it, I'd sort of proceeded calmly through these arguments, one thing after another. Yes, this can take it. The spyderco, I can't pronounce it, Nicolita, or whatever, that is sharpened to about 10 degrees inclusive. It's a zero grind. Okay, but that's more expensive, even though that steel is less suited to angles like that because it's a medium carbide volume steel, S30V, and has less etch stability. It's less designed for such high apex angles, but okay, fine. What about another knife? Well, how about a Mora? Okay, that's, halfway in between what he says the minimum a steel like this can take and what I'm saying this steel failed grossly at. So $15 Mora versus $100-something roughly Richmond Artifex, is it reasonable then to say that this knife should be outperformed by that really inexpensive Mora, which is, I believe, so whereas this is AEB-L, which is a 13C26 analog, I believe the stainless Moras are 12C27, which is a very closely related steel. You can look at the chemistry, slight differences. So, again, is it reasonable that you have an expensive, allegedly high-grade knife that's being easily outperformed by a Mora? No, but none of these issues were really addressed. And then finally, Mark Richmond this morning decided to come into the thread, and I should also say that the actual argument that the knife wasn't performing the way it should be was broadly ignored in one sort of tangential experiment. The 10 degrees inclusive experiment was held up as a sign that I am nuts or something like that, and sort of the rest of it, all the whole actual performance issues were sort of glossed over. Okay. So Mark Richmond then comes in this morning and says that given the way I sharpen knives, I should not expect that this other knife I was interested in, which was not out of the Richmond line, would perform. So he is implicitly stating that, in fact, it is normal to expect his knives to fail cutting, basically, as Cliff says, saran wrap, if they are sharpened to 10 degrees inclusive. Now, obviously, you don't have to be terribly intelligent to realize that this is completely absurd. But this is sort of how that played out. And so, unfortunately, I can no longer be a patron of chefknives2go.com. It's very unfortunate. And it's a little bit sad to me because I actually learned about Chef Knives to Go from Clay Allison of Wicked Edge. And I actually had a serious problem with my Wicked Edge. I have a video on that as well. And I posted a sort of nasty review on it. And Clay Allison actually came out of nowhere and said, wow, I'm really sorry, let's get this fixed. And we talked and we worked together. And it was absolutely fantastic. He solved the problem and fixed, sent me the parts I needed. My sharpener, is working great now. And this is my sort of ideal how one of these customer service interactions should go. We had a problem. We discussed causes of the problem, potential resolutions. We diagnosed it correctly. A resolution was found, and it was resolved. Whereas in this, I was basically thrown into a shill forum full of sharks, and somebody put some blood in the water, and they ripped me apart. But anyway, so this is why I cannot patronize Chef Knives to Go anymore, and why I would certainly suggest that other people do not. And I would also like to say that there is a definitive difference between helping people in forums and throwing people to dogs in forums, and a great example of how it's done right is by Sal Glesser. You go onto his forums, and if you have a problem there, he will put problems on the forums in some cases. In my case, he put my problem on a forum unsolicited, but, he will address problems on the forums. He will take care of it. He does a great job, and I really strive to offer customer service on the level that people like Sal Glesser and Clay Allison do. It's certainly not perfect, but these I consider to really, in a lot of ways, be ideals within the industry, and this certainly is not. I did also want to quickly highlight some of the issues I had with this knife, because I didn't really go over it much. I sort of glossed over it both reviewing-wise and in the particular thread. The fact that I had experimented with it was broadly ignored. As you can see, the part that says Richmond has been mostly ground off, and this is because this is a meant to be a chisel ground knife for one-handed use. The problem is that Lamson & Goodenow had come through and sharpened it, just a tiny bevel, on this side, which meant that a great deal of material, if you think about it, per unit volume steel, had to be removed to reset this to flat so you could sharpen it on its flat face, which is how you're supposed to sharpen one of these knives. The problem with that was I discovered why they did it, and they did it because when AEB-L is heat treated like this, and I assume at this point it's heat treat because I have, with all these knives, ground the edges up and back to try and get rid of any burning from a machine which applied the actual apex bevel. Once I'd finally done that, I discovered that you're removing, it's at least my hypothesis, this is the mechanism, you're removing material at a slow enough rate that you cannot remove a wire edge, and in fact you can't even prevent a wire edge from forming if you're sharpening flat against the stone on this side. So you actually have to tilt it up like this and put a micro bevel on this side in order to sharpen it like this, which clearly is not how this steel or this knife is designed to behave. You can see the grind here is a little sloppy. I actually did that. I was doing it quickly and on a wet grinder, and I just ground this back off because it was also quite thick from the factory, which is not necessarily unfair. I don't know what standard specifications are for this knife, and it is technically a boning knife, so one would expect it to have a little bit more robust grind. I'm still not sure that as robust a grind as it came with was reasonable, because these boning knives were designed to be boning fish and not necessarily large land mammals and or rocks. So I didn't actually expect it to come with worse geometry than, say, a bussy, although it did. But so I can't say how much of this was really down to tradition, geometry, laziness, what have you. So I can't really comment on that. It wasn't great. I have done a great deal of grinding to it to try and bring it into line with a reasonable geometry, and it just also will not perform. Just like the other AEB-L Richmond, it's gummy, it's soft, it has low edge retention, and will be outperformed by, again, you know, entry level knives here. I mean, we're talking wusthof. I don't know if you can get cheap Henkels anymore. I certainly know there's a 50-something-year-old Henkels I work with that outperforms these. I mean, I have a Chicago cutlery knife that I think was crap when it's new, and it's certainly crap now, and that'll hold its own against these quite nicely. An AOS 8A, knifekits.com, Santoku, it'll hold its own against these. I mean, I've heard the argument that that they're cheap, and that's why it sort of justifies it. And, you know, I'll give that to them on some of the little QC fails, but the whole point of being sort of a worker's knife, cheap but high performance, is, you know, you get the high performance half because they're not actually that cheap. And with the exception of the M390 knife, which again is wear resistance, it's just not showing it. And I guess Mark Richmond says that this is how they're expected to perform. This is not abnormal. It is expected. It's not considered sufficient defect to merit a return or compensation or anything like that if this can't hold its own against another knife that's in its price category and is advertised certainly to be inferior to this knife. So I guess that's what it is. I will be following up. I have been looking actually for a nice kitchen knife, a nice gyuto to use. So I ordered one of the Setsos from the SFO, and I can only hope that that comes out well. I have every confidence in Spyderco and Sal Glesser. They very, very rarely disappoint, and when they do, they usually make a pretty good effort to back their products and to back up their brand, to the point, I think, where Sal has even been offering, I'm not sure whether it was a refund or store credit, something like that, but was offering money back for aesthetic quips on knives that they didn't sell. So knives they sold to dealers and dealers resold, which would mean they'd be taking a hit on each one, because they only get, standard retail markup is something like 40%, so they would be losing money on that. Anyway, wanted to go over this, wanted to go over why I can't support Chef Knives to Go. I realize this comes right on the heels of a major brand associated with Chef Knives to Go, including the Numbatana stones and some of the abrasive suspensions from Cliff Stamp's video. Also took some fire because apparently he hammered and censored Cliff Stamp, and now Mark Richmond hammered and censored me. It is what it is, I guess. So yeah, thanks for watching, and I hope this is useful to you. I hope you don't get bitten, because I mean, yeah, I like to play with fine cutlery, but taking a $200 hit on knives, an almost $200 hit on knives that don't work, and then being told that they're supposed to be that way, I don't know, burns me a little bit. But it is what it is. You buy these things to experiment, and it doesn't always work out. Thanks for watching, guys, and see you at the next video.